Yeah, so welcome everyone. Today we have the plenary session for Scott Sworts. I'm going to pass it over to Scott Sworts, who's going to give himself a brief introduction. So Scott, over to you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us at this virtual conference this year. We had hoped to have this face-to-face, but obviously circumstances have prevented that from happening this year. But we also hope to welcome you all physically to Oxford in 2 years when we'll be hosting what we hope to be a return to normalcy and face-to-face life. As Elizabeth said, my name is Scott Sworts. I'm the postgraduate program lead here for architecture at Oxford Brookes. I am also a licensed architect in the United States. I got my master's degree from the University of Colorado at Denver. And that's probably all you really are all that interested in my biography. So I want to kind of frame what I'm going to be talking about today and also the conference theme. We, in a master stroke of prophecy, and I really should have gone and bought a lottery ticket that day, we set the conference theme as opportunities in crisis, not imagining that less than a few months later, the entire world would be in crisis with a COVID pandemic. We had set the theme based on what I'm going to be talking about today, which is the events of September 11th, 2001, on the close to the 20th anniversary of the events of that day. So on that, I will share my screen, and if somebody could just confirm that you can see my screen. Does everyone see it? Okay, great. So the title of today's presentation, World Trade Center, Rebirth, Reincarnation. So I just want to give you a brief outline. Today's presentation will be done in 3 parts. The first part of the presentation is going to look at the original World Trade Center, the events of 9/11, and the immediate aftermath of that attack. Part 2 is going to look at the reconstruction process, starting with the work of my students at the University of Colorado and ending with the mostly completed reconstruction of Ground Zero. And then part 3 will open a discussion on the effects of 9/11 on the United States and the rest of the world. I do want to give a trigger warning. This presentation will discuss issues around terrorism and death. Although no images that I will be showing today will be depicting victims, there will be some disturbing images in the slideshow. So I just don't want anybody to be caught unaware of that. So the first part, the original World Trade Center. Just to give you some statistics, 2 buildings were or 2 places were attacked on 9/11. The World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The World Trade Center, the entire site was 16 acres. Just for comparison, the Pentagon, which is the world's largest office building, covers 34 acres. The office complex had 12 million square feet of office space. And apologies for those of you who are in parts of the world that are more civilized and live on metric. I do not know the equivalent in square meters, but it's somewhere around 4 million square meters-ish, I believe. Each floor was 1 full acre in size. So that's a really mind-boggling statistic. People don't quite realize how large this project was. By comparison, the Pentagon, which it was and is the world's largest office building, freestanding, is only 6.5 million square feet. The Sears Tower, which was until the completion of the new One World Trade Center building, was the largest building or largest skyscraper in America, is only 4.5 million square feet. And for comparison, because when we did this work, we were at the University of Colorado Boulder. That entire campus, including the football stadium, all the halls of residence, everything else, is only 7.5 million square feet of interior space. So just to give you a bit of understanding about what happened with why the building collapsed, it's important to start off with a couple of structural innovations that the architect developed for the World Trade Center. The skin of the building was a major part of the structural support. So unlike the average skyscraper, the exterior skin of the World Trade Center was actually load bearing. In most skyscrapers, the exterior skin is what we would call a curtain wall, which means it doesn't carry any weight. But with this building, it was built much like an older building where the skin was load bearing. The only other structural elements in the building were in the building's core. What this allowed for was vast open plate design on each individual floor to maximize the occupiable and rentable space in each building. These two systems were tied together with a steel joist system, again, allowing for complete clear span from the building core to the building perimeter. This contributed to what happened on 9/11. Also, just to contextualize this, it's important to understand a very little known piece of the history of Ground Zero, where the World Trade Center was located. When they built the World Trade Center, Robert Moses, the planner for the city of New York at the time, ordered the obliteration of an existing neighborhood. That neighborhood was known as Little Syria. The demographics of this area were skewed towards one group. The residents of the area were almost all young, male, and Muslim. They were also mostly immigrants from the Middle East. As I learned when I was working on the project, this was part of the reason why it was always the World Trade Center that had been targeted by bin Laden. Not only was it a symbol, it was a symbol built on an obliterated Muslim neighborhood. That is not to justify anything, but it is an important piece of context to know why, of all of the buildings in New York City, the World Trade Center was targeted. So September 11th, 2001. I also want to frame the discussion with this quote from E.B. White's Here is New York, written in 1949. The city, for the first time in its long history, is destructible. A single flight of planes, no bigger than a wedge of geese, can quickly end this island fantasy. Burn the towers, crumble the bridges, turn the underground passages into lethal chambers, cremate the millions. The intimation of mortality is part of New York now, in the sound of jets overhead, in the black headlines of the latest edition. Written 51 years before 9/11, those words came home. So why did the buildings collapse? Again, I want to stress this as a very important thing, because there are lots of conspiracies, there are lots of misinformation going around what happened on 9/11, and it is critically important for people to understand why this happened. The buildings survived the impact of the planes. What happened was the burning jet fuel melted the joists that tied the core to the structural skin. Without that connection, the exterior became unsupported and the skin peeled away from the building. That loss caused the top of the tower to fall into the lower part, which brought the entire building down. The reason, and you will hear people say this building looked like an implosion, The building failed for the exact same reason that implosion brings down a building. So I have included and embedded a little video. Apologies for the potato quality of this. I screen captured this off of TLC years ago when the technology wasn't great, and I've not ever been able to find this since. So, but this graphic shows how the building's structural system was damaged. And you can see as that exterior collapses, it brings the full weight of that top part of the building down onto the bottom. And the reason that it looks like an implosion is the top 40 stories directly landing on the lower 100 or lower 60 stories collapsed the entire building in a pancake, what we would call a pancake collapse. The reason that the other building took a little longer to deconstruct was there was less weight above it as the planes hit higher. So a question that always comes out from this is, were the buildings flawed? It's important to note most buildings would have collapsed at the moment of impact. And the reason for this is the designers of the World Trade Center were aware of the 1945 collision of a B-25 bomber with the Empire State Building. And they knew that this was a possibility with 3 major international airports right around Manhattan, that there is always the chance that something could happen and a plane could strike a building. So they took into the design guidelines the design of of a 727 hitting the building, which was the largest commercial airplane at the time. It would actually have taken covering the steel with the exact same material used in the space shuttle tiles to be able to resist the heat generated by burning jet fuel. Burning jet fuel burns at an incredibly high temperature, and steel softens. You don't have to completely melt it. It gets soft at a relatively low temperature. So this is what happened in the building.
Hola, Fran, ¿cómo estás? Okay.
So could more lives have been saved? That is a very important question. The first issue was grounding the rescue helicopters. On 9/11, Rudy Giuliani made a decision to ground the rescue helicopters. When the buildings were designed, they were designed with an intent that above a fire, all victims would be rescued from the roof, or all trapped people would be rescued from the roof. This is why there were helipads on the top of both buildings. Rudy Giuliani made the deliberate decision to not allow the rescue helicopters to go out. We'll return to this decision later, but this decision was extraordinarily upsetting to the people of New York. Second issue was there were no dedicated stairways for firefighters. This created congestion in the building because you had firefighters going up the same evacuation staircases that people were fleeing down. Adding to the congestion was the fact that people, very understandably, did not want to abandon their wheelchairs and be carried out piggyback. So you had people coming down the stairs in wheelchairs while firefighters with equipment were going up the stairwells. Additionally, the walls in the stairwells weren't fireproof, which allowed for burn through. Again, the plan was in the event of a fire that everybody above the fire would be rescued from the rooftop. Because of this, there was no ability for people to go below the fire in the staircase. And then finally, the building didn't have modern foam fire suppression systems, which would have helped smother even jet fuel fire. because it had water-based fire suppression system. The water hit the jet fuel, splattering, burning jet fuel further, making the situation worse, not better. So the aftermath. Here is, just to contextualize the damage. The darkest red in the center here is ground zero. This area in the slightly lighter red color is the area of heaviest damage. And each circle is slightly less damage out to the yellow circle. And every place that the yellow circle touched suffered some damage, whether it was from debris, infrastructure damage, or just particulate dust. Just to give you a sense of scale of this, because Common Ground is located in Illinois, I thought I would show it on Chicago. So for those of you from Common Ground, here is the damage mapped over the center of Chicago, with ground zero being placed over the Sears, or now Willis, Tower. We did this actually for the top 10 cities in America. Denver has America's 10th largest central business district, so it's the smallest of the top 10. And you can see that the damage would take out virtually the entirety of the central business district in Denver. So the buildings that suffered total collapse on 9/11, World Trade Center 1 and 2, the two towers, the Marriott Hotel, World Trade Center 3, World Trade Center 7, which was the building across the street, and St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church. And a photo showing the damage of the South Tower. Partially collapsed were World Trade Center number 4, which was removed during the cleanup, the Port Authority Police Station, otherwise known as WTC 5, which was removed, the Customs House 6 was removed, and the World Trade Center shopping concourse was heavily damaged. It was partially removed during cleanup, and then the rest was removed during the reconstruction. So here's a picture of the partial collapse of WTC 5. Buildings that got heavy damage: the Verizon building, World Financial Center 2, 3, the World Financial Center Winter Garden, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization building. All of these were repaired, as was 90 West Street. The Bankers Trust building, otherwise known as the Deutsche Bank building, was deconstructed. And this is why. It took out a major support column. There was no way to ever save this building. And in fact, this building took more lives up to a decade after the events of 9/11, because the deconstruction process cost other lives. Moderate damage happened up to a quarter of a mile from the site. The buildings in this area had facade damage, broken windows, and minor structural damage, as well as an extremely heavy coating of pulverized debris. Some structures in this area were unoccupied for almost 2 years. So here's the debris in the World Financial Center. And these buildings, Millennium Hotel, One Liberty Plaza, the Marriott, the US Post Office, the Bank of New York Community College, and the Cedar Street Co-ops. And as I said, all of these were repaired and reopened within 2 years. Here's the damage to One Liberty Plaza. Then light damage happened for up to half a mile. Buildings in this area had broken windows, facade damage, heavy debris coating. All of the buildings reopened within 6 months. So you can see that heavy debris coating here at the Trinity Church. And infrastructure damage extended up to 2 miles from this site. So these areas experienced problems with utilities, torn up streets, and the loss of subway service for several years. In fact, the final piece of the subway reconnection did not happen until just a couple of years ago. This area was economically devastated by the loss of business. So here, all the way down at Whitehall Ferry, you can see the debris field even this far away. So part two is going to look at what we did in the reconstruction and the part that we played in the rehabilitation and regeneration of the World Trade Center. Before I launch into this, I want to give a little bit of context about why myself and a group of students from the University of Colorado in Boulder, which would not seem to be the most obvious choice of the group of students to be working formally with the reconstruction, why we got involved. And the reason that we got involved actually sort of happened in what I might call an opportunity of crisis. At the time, I was dating a woman who was from New York City. And we had actually spent the first 24 hours wondering if her aunt, who had worked in the World Trade Center, was even alive because we couldn't get through to her. She'd actually gotten ill that morning and had not gone to work. But because the phone lines in New York were down and jammed, it took 24 hours to get through. But as Amelie was very close to New York, had studied architecture in New York, the day 2 days after the events of 9/11, there was a lecture given in the School of Engineering at our campus, and we decided to attend. At the lecture, we discovered that the original project engineer of the World Trade Center, a gentleman by the name of Hy Brown, taught at the University of Colorado and happened to be at the time close personal friends with Mayor Giuliani. Again, more said on that in a moment. And he had been asked by Giuliani, first of all, to look at why the collapse had happened, and then also to help sort out the reconstruction. And after the lecture, Amelie and I went up to Hy and introduced ourselves as faculty from the School of Architecture and said that, you know, the School of Architecture would like to be involved in this project. And from that point on, we were formally involved in the reconstruction project. I had boots on the ground in New York City when the World Trade Center was not even completely extinct. The fires were not completely extinguished. So myself and Hy continued to work on this. Amelie stepped aside because it was just a little too close to home, and she had lost some close friends in the collapse and had stepped aside because it became a little bit much for her to deal with. But Hy and I worked on this for the first few months. I did not meet Mayor Giuliani, and will say some negative things about him, so apologies if you're a fan. We were working on getting a studio of students out to New York to work on the project. Mayor Giuliani had been pressuring the city of New York to unilaterally extend his term, and because he was due to leave office, there was an election shortly after 9/11. He was term limited, and he had tried to remain in office, even though he was not going to be mayor anymore, a theme which repeated itself 20 years later. And the minute that the New York City Council said, no, you're done, Giuliani washed his hands of the entire reconstruction effort. He walked away entirely, said that he'd do nothing more, and convinced Hy to also walk away from it and not lend his services, because as I said, they were close personal friends. Which I was standing in the middle of ground zero when I got the cell phone call saying that Hy was no longer going to be involved. And I had 16 students who were due to arrive in New York 3 days later. we put together a brand new coalition to work on this. Fortunately, I had met many people there, and we got to work on working with actually a much better group to be working with, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. But I just wanted to frame why we were working on this project. So here was one of my early site visits. This was in January of 2002. So we worked with the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation and an organization called RDOT, which was Rebuild Downtown Our Town, to write a preliminary set of redevelopment guidelines. These are the guidelines that we wrote, which were later adopted by the LMDC for the reconstruction. So the first thing was the idea of a World Trade Center is not as appropriate as it was 40 years ago. To answer today's needs, the site must become mixed use with 24/7 activity. The redevelopment cannot carry a corporate label, nor should it be identified with one industry or corporation. The design has to respond to both the need for closure and provide the foundation of a new beginning. The survivors and families of victims must have their needs met, and they must be provided a way to deal with their emotions. The residents of New York, and most especially downtown residents, must play a dominant role in the rebuilding. The design needs to reflect the culture and vitality of New York City. And we ended with an admonition that the world will watch what's done on the site, and it will influence architecture, urban design, and planning for decades to come. So, and apologies, I actually should have said this. This was one of our design proposals. This was done by a student by the name of Anthony Hines. This is another design proposal by a student named Michael Kroll. And some of our planning points. Converting the entire site to a park will create, and we apologize for this pun, a dead zone for activity in Lower Manhattan. Elements of the original street grid must be reintroduced, breaking up the super block that was created when Moses obliterated Little Syria. We also argued the West Side Highway should be submerged below grade south of Chambers. And then at grade, this strip of land should be developed as open space. We also advocated for reconnecting Greenwich Street. We introduced the managed street concept, which means that you can only drive in very limited applications, not only on the site, but throughout Lower Manhattan. We argued to create a transit hub that would encompass the path lines, subways, bus lines, redevelop Fulton Street Station as a linear station to reconnect or to link all the transit lines, reconstruct the parking garage to provide parking for downtown, and rebuild the infrastructure so that upgrades can be made with minimal impact. This project by Jose La Cruz Crawford is, I think, probably one of the most influential projects, as Daniel Libeskind later references the shadow patterns of the towers, which this entire project was built based off of. So, and again, we know Libeskind had access to all of our material. I do not want to accuse one of the world's most preeminent architects of any sort of a misappropriation of our students' work. But architecture is a profession where we learn from precedents from each other. And this certainly would have been one of the precedents on his desk. This was a project by Nicole Rasmussen called The Cycle of Life. So for architecture, we argued the buildings on the site should not be the work of one architect. They should be an evolutionary process involving many architects over an extended period of time. The architecture needs to look to the future. The green technologies and construction methods must be employed. The architecture needs to give something positive to the New York skyline. The buildings need to be flexible in their use and able to adapt. Tall buildings should be located in the southeast corner of the site, closer to the other tall buildings of Lower Manhattan. The buildings on the north of the side of the site should be lower, in keeping with the character and scale of Tribeca. No buildings should be developed that would require a super block, and we need to keep the street level pedestrian friendly. So this is another view of Anthony Heinz's project, Unity. This project by Jessica Meyer was called A Place to Live. I do want to note also one thing we did in the studio, because we were occupying space both in New York City and in the University of Colorado. We created what was, I think at the time, one of the very first all digital design studios, really recognizing the importance of digital technology in crisis relief and the ability for us to be able to work in a very fluid manner through the use and implementation of digital software. For the memorial design, we felt the memorial needed to be the first thing developed on the site. The memorial needed to have two aspects, individual and societal. The individual aspect was to provide people with a way to deal with grief and loss and to connect with their emotions. And the memorial needed to provide a mechanism for people to leave objects behind, as leaving flowers on a grave. The societal aspect needed to provide the community with a way to mark the event and connect with history. The memorial needed to be meaningful to a future generation where no one alive will have firsthand memory of the events of 9/11. It needs to be an ongoing time capsule. In other words, it needs to be able to capture events and histories in a rolling manner. It needed to be located on the footprints of the original towers. This is hallowed ground and needs to be reflected. And we advocated for the use of what might be called sacred geometries to reflect the religions of the world in a non-denominational way. This project by Adam Hillhouse, I think, was my favorite of the memorials. He did not advocate for memorializing on site only. He suggested putting memorial markers literally across the globe, where every victim of 9/11 in their favorite place where they lived, where they worked, because this event impacted 130 countries and they lost citizens. So he wanted to make the memorial equally global. This was a memorial designed by Tyler Cooper. So the redevelopment, what happened? We wrote that set of guidelines, then what happened? Well, what happened was they redeveloped the site. We won some, we lost some, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It is one of the largest urban redevelopment projects in history. It was the largest project of its kind since World War II. The Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, otherwise known as the LMDC, was created to address the rebuilding of the site. So we won some. We won some very important ones. We got the super block divided. Greenwich Street was reconnected and the grid was reintroduced. The footprint of World Trade Center 7 was reduced, allowing for Greenwich to be fully reconnected across Lower Manhattan. We got the transit hub. They have built a new Grand Central Station connecting all of the Fulton Street lines all the way out to the PATH trains. The use of green technologies was mandated in the entire project. And although it's not completed yet, there will be a performance center and other community-friendly elements on site. So we got that. We won some, but we didn't win everything. The development essentially replaced all 12 million square feet of office space. It left the underground, it left the shopping mall underground and increased its size to 600,000 square feet. There's no real residential development on the site, only office space, retail, and a hotel. The designs generally lack vision. And most importantly, the transit hub cost $4 billion, which took away vital funding from other infrastructure projects in Manhattan. And then there's the ugly. There was really no open public commentary during development and only limited, tightly controlled forums for review. The development spilled beyond the site. It forced the removal of existing residential and retail developments. It overwhelmed an already overbuilt real estate market, depressing the real estate values in Lower Manhattan all the way up till the real estate collapse in 2008, and the real estate market has still not fully recovered. And the whole design prioritized profit over community desires. So why did this all happen? Well, one important thing to realize in any sort of crisis situation is you've got politics involved. There were a lot of different groups with very, very different agendas. Each group had a point of view that had merit. None were easily discarded, but each group also had unrealistic expectations. So we had these players, the Port Authority, which was the owner of the site, then Governor George Pataki, Mayor Michael Bloomberg, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, and John Whitehead, who was the head of that corporation, Larry Silverstein, who owned the leases to the World Trade Center, Westfield America, which held the lease to the shopping center, Rebuild Downtown Our Town, which was a grassroots organization of architects, designers, and urban planners, as well as residents of the area, and then the Widows and Survivors Organization. So the site is owned by the Port Authority. And as I said, two people hold leases to the buildings, Larry Silverstein and Westfield. So the Port Authority is a corporation and it has to turn a profit under law, but its leadership is appointed by government officials who have to answer to the electorate. That makes it very difficult to work with the Port Authority because they've got competing interests. They own the port, many of the tunnels and the bridges into Manhattan, and they exist in a sphere of control that is a circle 25 miles in diameter with the center right at the Statue of Liberty. Everyone at the Port Authority involved in the leasing of the World Trade Center died on 9/11. There was actually a meeting of the board to finalize the leasehold, which Larry Silverstein did not make, or he would have been lost in the events as well. But every other person who made the decision to lease the buildings died in 9/11. And literally, we don't know why the Port Authority chose to lease the buildings to Silverstein. They had resisted leasing for 40 years, and then about 2 months before 9/11, had decided to lease the buildings. Larry Silverstein claimed his lease required the Port Authority to rebuild the site exactly as it was. He was required to continue paying $1 million per month for his lease, even though the site was destroyed. He fought his insurance company in a massive legal battle for $7 billion. He only wound up with $4.5 billion, but he refused to relinquish his lease. He saw it as his legacy. He actually was very opposed to dedicating any significant piece of the site to a memorial. He claimed to be willing to consider a plaque with the names of the victims, but that was all. He felt restoring the buildings and turning a profit would be the best memorial possible. And he felt that that would make a very strong statement. This also complicated the process because, as you can imagine, for those of you who work in crisis situations, how this was reacted to by the widows and survivors and the people of Lower Manhattan. The governor was up for re-election and the redevelopment became an issue. Mayor Bloomberg had to listen to his constituents. The mayor tried to barter off the World Trade Center site for the New York airports so that the city would control the site rather than the Port Authority, but that failed. So the victims didn't want to see profit-driven development on the site. They wanted only development for the public goods, such as museums, cultural centers, hospitals, low-cost housing. They viewed the site, especially the footprints, as a graveyard that needed to be respected. And for many of them, because there literally were no bodies to remove in the collapse, This is the only place where people could feel close to their dead. Then we had Rebuild Downtown Our Town, which was trying to negotiate everything. This was the group I was involved with. They were promoting sensible redevelopment. And this was the only place that there was a public forum for discussion. So fortunately, the LMDC took them seriously. They wanted to see a vibrant community developed on the site, including office space, retail, restaurants, art galleries, and residential. They wanted it to be green and sustainable. They wanted the site design chosen through international competition, which they eventually got, which Daniel Libeskind won. They wanted the redevelopment to be a precedent for all future urban development. So this is what we got. This is from St. Paul's Church. And you see World Trade Center 1 and 7 in the background here. The Oculus, which may very well be the world's most expensive transit hub. World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 3, and in the back here you see 7. Here is the entry to the shopping mall. Some shots of the memorial. And St. Nicholas, which the last time I was in New York 2 years ago, before travel stopped being a thing, was still under reconstruction. So I want to take a couple of minutes here just to end with a recontextualization. So when we were working on the initial planning, a statement was made that we should not attempt a memorial for 20 years because it would take that long to understand 9/11's place in history. With our exit from Afghanistan this year, after a 20-year war, which, by the way, was the longest war in the history of the United States, we really can only now begin to place the events of 9/11 into some sort of a context. So what 9/11 was it? A lot of the predictions people were saying when we were working on this have not come to pass. It didn't upend global power structures. It didn't usher in an era of asymmetric warfare on a global scale. We did not have an era of terrorist warfare across the globe. It did not fundamentally change the way we build cities. It didn't alter New York City's status as a global center of finance and commerce. All of those things were predictions that were being made on 9/11 or in the short aftermath. But what it did do, it was a moment of profound change to aspects of American life. It created fear of the world that turned the focus of many people inwards, away from globalism and towards a new embrace of nationalism. This in turn fractured politics, ushered in what I will call security theater, and opened the door to what I would term weaponized conspiracies. So fractured politics. 9/11 fractured the politics in America, which is still playing out today. Both parties have a significant internal split now between globalists and nationalists. We see this in both the Republicans and the Democrats, where you have Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, who are both inward nationalists, and outward globalists like Liz Cheney and Hillary Clinton. It redefined patriotism in the political sphere more than any event since Vietnam. The decision to go to war in Iraq was a direct follow-on from 9/11, creating further splits. Again, 9/11, Iraq was not involved in 9/11, but the willingness to do that war, the door was opened because of 9/11, and that has created further splits in politics, as especially evidenced by the battle between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton in 2016 over who voted for authorizing military force in Iraq. And the interventionism that was spawned out of this strained international relations with many allies, as you can remember from France condemning it, and then suddenly the US Capitol having freedom fries in the Capitol commissary. It also introduced what I would term security theater. So after 9/11, new security protocols were instituted. But many of these protocols were what could be termed security theater, meaning they're focused more on the appearance of adding security more than actually making people safer. Things like removing shoes at the airport, at any airport in America, which now living in the UK, I have not had to take my shoes off getting on an airplane for years, except when I've come back to the United States. It makes you feel better and it makes you feel safer. But the question is it really arguably making you that much safer? We created an entire new department, the Department of Homeland Security, and an associated cabinet official. But it's important to note 20 years later, similar intelligence failures, or more particularly, an unwillingness to listen to the intelligence, allowed a new domestic terrorist attack coup earlier this year. And then finally, one of the most profound shifts after 9/11 was what I would call the mainstreaming of conspiracies. These have been around for decades. I mean, obviously, we still argue about who killed John F. Kennedy. But after 9/11, they became much more mainstream, but they also became a tool to provide cover to avoid real questions. I do want to note the Bush administration did not intentionally feed these theories, but they diverted away from real questions and failures. A lot of the conspiracies around 9/11 sucked up what I would call all of the oxygen in the room for actual real questions. So what were the real questions? What are the things we still don't know? Why were intelligence reports discounted? What was Saudi Arabia's role? Did the CIA's funding of bin Laden and the Taliban during the Russian occupation of Afghanistan have any bearing on 9/11? What are the health impacts of the collapse of the Twin Towers? So again, the conspiracies around 9/11 and the reaction to them marginalized the people asking these questions because it allowed them to start getting lumped into the conspiracy theorists. So that's a very important piece of it. And it gave birth to what we would call the shiny object, which is now ubiquitous in American politics. So to distract from real failures, both parties now engage in what we might call conspiracy talk about events and or opposing sides that dominate the news cycle, marginalizing questions and really distract us from understanding events. But I don't want to leave you entirely without hope, because this has been a very downer end to my talk. There has been a bright side. Although there were many negative outcomes, and 9/11 has certainly added to the disruption ongoing in the United States, it did lead to some positives. It birthed an international coalition to fight terrorism and extremist views. It showed how important resilience thinking is in crisis response, and it showed the critical nature of community spirit in the face of disaster. So what I want to end with is really that spot of hope. RDOT and the people of Lower Manhattan did not win every battle that they set out to win in the redevelopment of Ground Zero, but they won most of the big ones. Their input and the response of the community and the insistence of the community to remain having a seat at the table guided the response to 9/11, guided the rebuilding of Ground Zero. And I think that community engagement really should be the model for how we address crises in the future. So on that, I will stop sharing screen. I do apologize for taking much longer than I think I was supposed to. I tried talking very fast, but.
Oh, no, thank you, Scott, for that amazing presentation. We're going to move into the Q&A. We have time for a few questions. So if you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat or raise your hand. It looks like the first question is from Angeliki. Angeliki, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question for Scott?
Good afternoon, Scott.
Hello?
Just a quick question for you. This is the first time I'm hearing anything about this subject, and it was such an interesting thing to listen to. But it sounds like there were so many people pulling from different directions, all these stakeholders involved in this. And I was wondering, then in the end, are you happy and satisfied with the end result and the choices that were made? Do you feel that there were some compromises? And if so, what were these?
So I'll answer the latter part first. Yes, there were compromises. With that many stakeholders, we would never have been able to have any one view dominate. So everything was compromised. However, I'm satisfied with the outcome because we did win some of the big ones. We got the super block broken up. We got community facilities there. We, most importantly, preserved the footprint of the towers. And that was the first thing, the memorial was the first thing that got built on the site. So people had the memorial before they had any of the other development. So, you know, there were compromises. We really wish we could have won the battle on getting West Side Highway submerged. That was probably our biggest loss. But at the same point in time, recognizing how much the Oculus cost to build, we probably could not have gotten West Side Highway submerged because that would have not, that would have dramatically increased the budget when we didn't have any extra money to spend. Did I answer everything? I think I did, but I.
You did, and thank you very much for this. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Angeliki. Does anybody else have a question? If you have a question, feel free to use a little Zoom, raise your hand, or you can type your name in the chat.
Well, while we're waiting for a question, I will add one anecdote that is very, very powerful. My first meeting with RDOT, which was right after Giuliani reluctantly vacated his mayoral office. One of the stakeholders, who will remain nameless because I will not out them, said, Mayor Giuliani may be America's mayor, but he is not now, nor has he ever been New York City's mayor. Just an interesting little anecdote about Giuliani. I see Bob's uncovered himself. Bob, do you want to ask me a question?
Yeah, that was a fantastic presentation, Scott. They're really, really excellent. And I just love ending on a kick to Giuliani. That's a perfect finish to the talk. So any of your students who obviously were integrally involved in this, did any of them continue their work in community resilience and the kind of work that you was inspired there?
Some of the planners did. Actually, a couple of the people have left architecture entirely. One actually became an artist, and she's now a professional photographer. Some of them went to work on the rebuilding of New Orleans after Katrina, which I think was a good legacy. Unfortunately, this was such an emerging field at the time that a lot of them didn't really know how to engage past this. I mean, like I said, a couple of them went to work on the reconstruction in New Orleans and flew down there and helped build houses. But sadly, most of them went much more conventional architecture routes.
Thank you. It looks like the next question is coming from Supriya. Supriya, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi,
Hello,
Supriya.
Hi, thank you, Scott. I mean, you actually brought for me some memories of this place because I mean, I had visited it about 2 years ago, and you just let me contextualize some of the structures that I saw over there, and I had no idea about its history. So it was really very interesting presentation. My question too is a bit, I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on the broader or the wider lessons that you think can be learned from this particular case in terms of, building resilience. So is there some sort of a broader lessons that you think you can, share, which can be applied to also many other places
Yeah,
from
so
this
I
space?
think
Yeah.
I think one of the first things is really early in the process pushing back against profit motive. Because especially in an area that is wealthy before the events, they see it as a way, and Larry Silverstein certainly saw it as a way to insert profit motive into the process. And by really getting some pushback from groups like RDOT, and by the American Institute of Architects in New York City, and actually by even some people at SOM, it took some of the profit out, some of the profit drivers out of the redevelopment, which even though it's still a massively overscaled project, it was less. I think one of the other really important lessons for me from this particular case is the importance of persistence from the community groups, and the fact that we would not shut up and that we kept knocking on doors. And another important part, which really is underappreciated, is the importance of artists, architects, and designers in the process, creating visions and creating design ideas. So one of the beauties of what we did with the students was we didn't just write a set of guidelines. We had projects in that initial manual that allowed people to get an idea of what those words might look like put into practice. And that visual thinking part of it, I think, is probably my biggest takeaway, is the sooner you can get in there with visions. And we weren't the only ones. Morpheus Gallery, I think it was Morpheus Gallery in New York City, hosted a collection of projects from various architects. Sam Mockbee, Zaha Hadid contributed, a number of architects. So there were a lot of artists and architects who were creating visual representations of what this should be. And because we've given out those really inspiring images of what this might be, when the LMDC, which had just privately contracted with, I believe it was Fox and Fowle, to come up with 7 different very corporatist sorts of architectural designs and plans, everybody freaked out because they saw what it could be from work by groups like ours, and then this incredibly bland corporatist vision. And I don't mean to disparage Fox and Fowle, but they created outrage because people saw what it could be, and then they felt that this crap, excuse my language, was being sort of shoved down their throat. And it's that, get the community on your side and don't stop, and get the artists involved, and get the artists and the architects drawing what people want to see. Our students went out into the community and they were talking to bar owners in Lower Manhattan. What would you like to see on this site? And shopkeepers and people on the street and residents in some of the lofts in Tribeca. And that guided their design, which then made things better. So does that give you some good takeaways?
Yeah, I think that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Scott.
You're welcome.
It looks like we have time for one more question, which is coming from Jason. Jason, did you want to unmute yourself and ask Scott your question?
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering, at the beginning, you mentioned that they wanted to maximize the office space and the profit, so they left the core to the perimeter unobstructed, and that contributed to what happened. I'm just wondering, in general, I was just curious, like, is there an alternative architecture that you've feel was feasible at the time that could have lessened the damage or prevented parts of it?
No, I mean, the reality of it is that most buildings would have fallen over regardless. And, you know, weaponizing airplanes and particularly weaponizing jet fuel, about the only way you could really have protected the building would, as I said, have been to use something like the space shuttle tiles over all of the members. That can be done. And it would cost, well, at the time, when we were doing this 20 years ago, that would have made the building cost around $1,000 a square foot to use that kind of tile technology. Now I'm sure it would be considerably more than that. The design itself was very innovative. And, you know, when you're innovative, there's always a bit of a risk involved in that. And in hindsight, maybe they could have spent a little bit less time thinking about profit. But to be honest with you, as deeply as those planes penetrated, even a traditional building would have been taken out. And in fact, actually, traditional construction might have been taken out quicker because each column would have carried a share of the load and more columns would have been knocked out.
Right, okay. Yeah, I was just wondering. So
No,
thanks.
no, no, it's a very valid question. And believe me, architects have questioned this for 20 years now.
Mhm.
Thank you, Jason, for your question. So it looks like we're coming up to the end of our hour. Kinsey went ahead and posted the link for the discussion board for Scott's plenary session. So if anyone has any other questions or would like to continue the discussion, feel free to use that link to continue to ask questions. And we also posted a link for tomorrow's sessions as well. So I hope everyone enjoyed the session, and I want to thank Scott again for that amazing presentation. The recording will be up online later today for everyone. And thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.